This is part two of the exodus of Jews from Arab countries. Israel, in early 1949, was in terrible shape. 1% of the population was killed in the war of 1 year duration, which would be equivalent to 3.3 million deaths in the United States. They had few natural resources. They were broke. They had an untrained bureaucracy, unfamiliar customs with the new immigrants, and there were even discrimination against Sephardim, who only were 20% of the pre-war Jewish population. Here you see on the left arrivals from Yemen at Lud Airport, and in the center, Iraqi Jews arriving at Lud. In 3.5 years, a total of 688,000 Jews came into the country, averaging about 200,000 a year, doubling the population during that period of time. From 1949 to 1951, approximately 50% came from Arab countries. They had more children, more illiteracy, less prime wage earners, and less education than European Jews who came at the same time from Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. However, even under these extreme circumstances, Ben-Gurion believed in the ingathering of exiles, and he overrode any qualms by other ministers. When Jews arrived, they collected first their Israeli passport. Next slide. Then they were sent to Sha'ar HaAliyah for their first arrangements. This was a processing camp where there were medical checks, and this camp was near Haifa. Here you see Jews lining up for lunch and in their tents. Next slide. They were then sent to transit camps where food, shelter, and medicine were provided in tents. These were open wards for multiple families, very Spartan, with no running water or electricity in the tents. However, Jewish life did go on, even under these circumstances. Here you see children celebrating Tu B'Shvat in the Rosh Ha'ayin transit camp. Next. Because of the marked cost, the Israelis came up with a new concept called the Ma'abara. Here, the new immigrants needed to work to earn money, to cook their own food. They usually had their own tent, and if they were really lucky, they would get a tin hut, which you see here at Tiberias, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Next slide. In the winter, conditions were terrible, and there were a great deal of flooding in low-lying areas, and the IDF had to be called in to help. Here on the right, you see Libyan women just going to an open spigot to collect water. But again, life had to go on. Here you see Jews doing homework and being taught. And even teaching became a partisan issue, because then there were religious, general, and socialist tracks. And there were a number of overzealous socialist teachers who wanted to cut off the sideburns of Yemenites. Here you see a wedding of an Iraqi couple in a wooden hut, a Yemenite man getting ready for Shabbat for his chicken dinner, and Ben-Gurion, who was to be the sandik of a bris for a Yemenite family. And Ben-Gurion had a soft spot for Yemenites dating back to his early years in Palestine. Next. The immigrants were put to work in various jobs, clearing rocks, building roads, planting trees. And this was tough for these Jews because, remember, they were mainly urbanites and not used to manual labor. If they were lucky, Like these Yemenite Jews as welders, they would get a job in the private sector, and if they were very lucky, like this Yemenite silversmith, he would actually able to do what he did in his home country. Next. Again, later in the 1950s, there was another change in direction. There was a program called Ship to Settlement. This was to strengthen the periphery of the country, and it was mainly Moroccans who were involved. They would go to new development towns directly from their boat or plane, and here you see an early picture of Beersheba. It's greatly increased since then, or to Moshavs. And the Israelis government found that they needed to keep Jews from each country separate because of the propensity for fighting. The Kibbutzim were not especially helpful during this phase of the country. Next. Although there was a good deal of grumbling about the new immigrants, the Israelis, veterans, did pitch in. For a number of years, there was an austerity regime in Israel. And in fact, Israeli couscous was invented as the substitute for rice, which was in short supply. The medical community pitched in, and many young Jews regained their eyesight, which they had lost from the disease trachoma, which was very prevalent, particularly in North Africa, thanks to the surgical skill of Israeli doctors. Syria, before the 1930s, 1940s, had over 30,000 Jews. 20,000 were in Damascus, toward the south, and here you see on the lower slide, and 10,000 were in Aleppo, which you see on the right, and a very small number were in the far northeast, in Kamishli. Next. Most Jews had a traditional education, as you see, but thanks to the Alliance School, and here you see teachers, which was in Syria since 1865, many Jews became more westernized, as you see here. Even in the 1920s, when they were under a French mandate, you even had Zionist Maccabee youth movement in Syria. Just like in other countries, there were riots after the UN vote of November 29, 1947. In Aleppo, they took place December 1st, and all 18 synagogues and schools and 150 shops were either destroyed or damaged. Here you see the ancient Great Synagogue of Aleppo, which was greatly damaged during the riots. Their greatest treasure was the Aleppo Codex, and luckily it was hidden and eventually found its way to Jerusalem in 1957. This was the best and oldest Masoretic Codex, or a vocalized book of the Bible, was completed in 930 CE. It was actually used by Maimonides in Cairo in the 12th century. Here on the lower right, you see a page from the Aleppo Codex. For decades, it was thought the damage on the lower left was due to fire. It turns out it was due to a fungus from generations of Jews moistening their fingers to change the page. During these turbulent times, many Jews left to go to Beirut, and then for some on to the west, particularly Brooklyn, Israel, or Latin America. By the time of the Israeli War of Independence, the 30,000 Jews of Syria was down to about 5,000. During the War of Independence and afterwards, bank accounts were seized, property was frozen, they were kicked out of the civil service jobs, there were travel restrictions, they were watched by Syrian security. Here in the center, you see a letter for help for those trapped in Aleppo. On the right, you see Eli Cohen, who was hanged in Damascus in 1965. He was an Israeli spy who gave critical information about the Golan Heights fortifications, which was important in Israeli victory on the Golan during the Six-Day War. But it did cause increased attacks on Jews. The Syrian Jews languished in their prison until 1975, when Judy Carfeld, a Canadian Jew from Toronto, took up the cause. She started out by sending religious articles to Rabbi Hamra, Abraham Hamra, the chief rabbi of Syria in Damascus. Eventually, her program grew, and many other people took up the cause of freedom for Syrian Jews. Money came in, which was used for bakshish, or bribes in Syria, because in Syria, anything can be had for a certain price, and this was used to smuggle Jews to Turkey or Lebanon, working with Israeli agents. And here on the right, you see a couple who got out of Syria and being welcomed in Brooklyn. In 1994, President Assad allowed Jews who were down to 2.8 thousand to leave, of course, without any assets, because he wanted to mend fences with the U.S., who at the time was the only superpower. And here you see Judy Carfeld being congratulated by Shimon Peres for her work with Syrian Jews in 1996. There were 5,000 Jews in Lebanon, which was an oasis of relative calm for decades. The Jews had good relations with the government, who were regularly invited to attend Jewish holiday receptions. The great majority of Jews lived in the Wadi Abu Jamil district of Beirut. The main synagogue was Magen Avram. And here you see the usual things, a bar mitzvah celebration. You have a public lecture. During the summers, many Jews would go to either Boudon or LA in the mountains east of Beirut. Basically, it was like being in the Catskills for the summer. But things changed after the 1967 war. Palestinians moved into the Jewish quarter, as you see the overlap on the left, and about half the Jews left after the Six-Day War. And previously, in 1958, the refugees left after the first civil war between Christians and Jews. They had seen that before. Most of them had been from Syria, some from Iraq. In fact, Lebanon was the only Arab country which had an increase of Jews after 1948. The rest of the Jews left during the Second Civil War in the early 1970s, particularly after the kidnapping and death of Albert Elias in 1971, who was head of the Jewish community. End of part 2.